It began, as all mysteries do, with something small, a fragment of metal, a pattern in the sand, a sound that didn't belong. Each discovery, scattered across continents and centuries, whispered the same impossible message. Someone was here before us, or beside us. For decades, these objects have been called out-of-place artifacts, remnants of technologies that should not exist, traces of intelligence beyond the known boundaries of human history. Some appeared in the ruins of lost cities. Others emerged from rock older than life itself. Each one challenged not just science, but memory itself, the quiet assumption that our story began and ends with us. In 1947, a strange alloy fell from the New Mexico sky. In 1936, clay jars in Iraq hummed with ancient electricity. In the deep waters off Greece, a bronze machine turned with the precision of a mind that understood the stars. The pattern seemed clear, as if the past were leaving behind fragments of a forgotten conversation between humanity and something greater. Yet perhaps what's most haunting is not the artifacts themselves, but how they make us feel. Awe, disbelief, a quiet fear that history might be deeper than we were taught. For every artifact studied, another was sealed away, classified, hidden in vaults and archives beyond the reach of public curiosity. And so the line between evidence and myth began to blur, not because the truth vanished, but because the questions grew too vast for comfort. This is not a story of proof. It is a story of possibility, of how the human mind reaches toward the unknown, and what happens when the unknown reaches back. Each object in this chronicle, 10 artifacts forbidden to the ordinary world, carries a mystery that defies its own era. Metals that remember, stones that speak, crystals that seem to think. Whether they were built by forgotten ancestors or by something far beyond human hands, they reveal a pattern that is unmistakably intelligent. To ask whether these artifacts prove we are not alone is to misunderstand their meaning. What they truly prove is that curiosity endures, that across every age humankind has tried to listen, to decode the echoes that come from deep time. Maybe these echoes are not messages from elsewhere, but reflections of ourselves, the creative, restless impulse that builds, breaks, and builds again. Still, the questions remain. Why do these artifacts exist? Why do they appear centuries before their time? And why, even now, are we so afraid to face them? As the camera moves across deserts, oceans, and archives, the pattern unfolds. 10 fragments of impossible knowledge. 10 reminders that the story of intelligence on this planet or beyond it is far from complete. What if our greatest discovery is not that we are visited, but that we have always been watched by the echoes of our own future? It began in the heat of a desert summer, July 1947. A storm rolled across the New Mexico plains, lightning tearing open the horizon above Roswell. In the morning, something glittered in the sand, fragments of silver scattered like the remains of a broken thought. The official story was simple, a weather balloon. But those who saw the debris, soldiers, ranchers, and one quiet intelligence officer named Jesse Marcel, never forgot what they held in their hands. It was metal, yes, but unlike any metal they had seen before. Thin as paper, light as a feather, yet impossibly strong. When bent, it would softly unfold back into its perfect shape, as if remembering what it once was. They called it memory metal, though no one could explain the memory it kept. Marcel's descriptions were met with disbelief. The fragments he brought home to show his son would later vanish into classified archives, carried away under military guard. For decades, the pieces that once shimmered in the desert have been locked away, studied under the cold light of laboratories whose doors the public never sees. Inside those facilities, scientists found anomalies that challenged everything they knew about matter. The alloy's atomic structure seemed to hum with order, not random but arranged. Isotopes out of balance with anything formed on Earth. patterns in the crystal lattice that hinted at design, not chance. It reflected energy, deflected heat, and maintained a perfect surface, untouched by corrosion or flame. Some claimed it was simply advanced human research from the Cold War era, an experimental material misidentified by time. But others, studying its resilience, its self-restoring quality, whispered another question. What kind of mind could engineer metal that remembers its original form? Reports emerged from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base of technicians who watched as the fragments pulsed faintly under electromagnetic exposure, their surface shifting colors like liquid mercury. One scientist described it as programmable matter, decades before that phrase existed. If true, then Roswell was not just the birth of a modern myth. It was the moment humanity glimpsed a level of technology it was not yet ready to understand. Still, the evidence remains locked behind layers of classification, labeled and forgotten. Every few years, the story resurfaces: a declassified memo, a retired engineer's confession, a rediscovered photograph of a strange metallic scrap. Each clue feels like an echo from that July morning when a storm broke over the desert and something otherworldly fell to earth. But perhaps the deeper mystery is not where the material came from, but why it was hidden. Why does humanity bury the things it cannot explain? Do we fear the unknown or the reflection of our own potential within it? The memory metal of Roswell endures as both legend and symbol of the limits of science, of the fragility of truth, and of a deeper intuition that the boundaries of our knowledge are not walls but doors. Somewhere in a vault lit by white fluorescent light, that piece of impossible metal still waits, silent, weightless, remembering. And if it remembers, perhaps it also dreams of the moment we will finally understand it. It was 1936 when workers clearing earth outside Baghdad uncovered a cluster of clay jars. Each was unremarkable at first glance, coarse, hand-shaped, the color of dust. Yet inside them, archaeologist Wilhelm Koenig found something that made the air grow still. A copper cylinder, an iron rod, and traces of an acidic residue. To the untrained eye, it was ancient pottery. To Koenig, it was something stranger, a machine. The arrangement mirrored the anatomy of a modern battery: electrode, electrolyte, conductor. 2,000 years too early. At first, the discovery was dismissed as coincidence. The ancient world, scholars said, had no use for electricity. But Koenig could not forget what he'd seen. When replicas were built using the same design, they produced a faint but steady current. Enough to light a small bulb, enough to gild metal with chemical precision. Enough to whisper that the people who made these jars understood energy in ways history had long forgotten. Later analyses, some official, others hidden under the word classified, revealed details that defied simple explanation. Microscopic examination showed traces of fine wirework within the copper tubes, so delicate it seemed impossible for Bronze Age hands to craft. The metals resisted corrosion. The shapes were precise, the seams uniform. And buried in the residue were traces of rare elements that did not belong in the region's natural geology. More unsettling still, when several jars were connected in sequence, the current increased, not fading, not flickering, but strengthening, as if the vessels were meant to be joined. A network. A circuit older than any recorded civilization. Archaeologists began to speculate. What if these batteries were not isolated curiosities, but parts of a larger system? In the plains of ancient Mesopotamia, could there once have been an understanding, however partial, of stored power, of electrical flow, of light captured and released by human hands? In recent decades, restricted field studies have hinted at something remarkable. Beneath the soil around the original site, copper traces snake outward, thin lines like the veins of a buried machine. Some appear to lead toward long collapsed chambers. Others simply vanish into the earth, as though whatever structure they fed has long since dissolved into myth. Perhaps the Baghdad batteries were not evidence of alien intervention nor miracles of misplaced science, but something more haunting, proof that human curiosity repeats itself, that we discover, forget, and rediscover the same truth of this again and again, each time believing ourselves the first. It is possible that some ancient artisan, experimenting with metals and acids, stumbled upon a principle that would not be named for millennia. That his invention, misunderstood and abandoned, became an artifact buried by time, until the modern world dug it up and realized how little we truly know of our own beginnings. When Koenig's journals were rediscovered decades after his death, one note stood out among his sketches. He had written, "If they could make light, what else might they have imagined?" It is a question that lingers, not just for archaeologists, but for all of us who touch the edges of forgotten knowledge. Every civilization thinks it stands at the pinnacle of understanding. Yet in the quiet clay of Iraq, an ancient jar hums with electricity, reminding us that wisdom is not a ladder, but a circle. The Baghdad batteries remain in museum vaults, their secrets mostly silent. But perhaps, if one listens closely enough, there's still a faint hum beneath the dust, a pulse from 2,000 years ago waiting to complete its circuit once more. In the calm waters off the coast of Antikythera, Greece, a storm once claimed a ship 2,000 years ago. For centuries, the wreck lay silent beneath the waves, until a team of divers in 1901 surfaced with fragments of bronze unlike anything seen before. Corroded gears, inscribed plates, the relics of an impossible machine. At first, it seemed merely an ancient curiosity, an astronomical calculator, perhaps, or a navigational aid. But as decades passed and X-rays pierced the encrusted bronze, a more profound mystery emerged. The device, now called the Antikythera mechanism, was not a primitive clock. It was a computer. Its gears moved with mathematical precision, calculating the movements of the moon, the sun, and the planets. Its inscriptions spoke of eclipses, cycles, and celestial harmony. It was a mechanical reflection of the cosmos itself, built more than a millennium before the first mechanical clocks of Europe. How did such knowledge exist in an age when most of the world still measured time by the shadow of a stick? Recent scans, conducted in secret by research teams whose names appear only in obscure footnotes, have revealed something even stranger. Within the corroded bronze plates lie crystalline traces, structures at a microscopic scale that behave not like rusted metal, but like quantum circuitry. Under certain conditions, the fragments exhibit resonance, faint fluctuations in electromagnetic fields, as if some part of the machine still remembers how to think. It is, of course, impossible, or should be. Quantum mechanics would not even have a name for another 2,000 years. And yet, the Antikythera mechanism seems to hum with the mathematics of a universe it could not have known. When modern engineers attempted to reconstruct the gears, they found ratios that matched not only celestial patterns but physical constants, numbers that describe the behavior of matter itself. One historian, staring at the delicate bronze teeth through a microscope, whispered, "It's as though they weren't measuring the stars, but speaking to them." Was it a coincidence? A natural alignment between cosmic patterns and human curiosity? Or was the device a remnant of something far older, knowledge carried across forgotten ages, perhaps by civilizations erased by time or tide? Whatever its origin, the Antikythera mechanism stands as a paradox, a bridge between the mechanical and the miraculous. Its design required not only intelligence, but imagination. The ability to see the heavens as a system, governed by laws that could be predicted, calculated, perhaps even altered. Today, the fragments rest in a glass case in Athens, under the quiet watch of museum lights. The gears no longer turn, but in the mind's eye, one can almost hear the soft rhythm of bronze teeth engaging, a cosmic heartbeat rendered in metal. It reminds us that progress is not a straight line. Knowledge rises, falls, and returns again, wearing new faces each time. Somewhere in the wreckage of that ancient ship lies a truth both simple and vast, that long before we split the atom or map the stars, someone had already built a machine to understand the sky. And perhaps, like the sea that hid it for centuries, the universe still keeps its most extraordinary secrets in the depths, waiting for us to dive deep enough to find them. Deep in the jungles of Belize, beneath layers of root and stone, a shaft of sunlight struck something that shouldn't have been there. It was 1927 when British explorer F.A. Mitchell Hedges brushed aside centuries of dust to uncover a human skull carved from pure crystal, clear, flawless, and impossibly precise. At first, it seemed a relic of ritual, a sacred object in the ruins of a Mayan temple. But when light passed through it, strange things happened. Beams refracted in intricate paths, splitting into patterns that danced across the walls like living fire. The skull seemed to think in light. Experts who examined it found no tool marks, no seams, no sign of how such perfection could have been achieved. Quartz of that hardness should shatter under any primitive tool. And yet, this one had been carved against the grain, as though shaped not by chisels, but by intention itself. Then came the discovery that there was not just one. Across the world, from Mexico to Tibet, from South America to Central Europe, other crystal skulls began to surface, each different, yet somehow connected. When tested, they exhibited subtle electromagnetic resonances, pulsing in harmony as if tuned to an unseen signal. Some researchers, in studies shielded from the public eye, began to suspect that these artifacts formed part of a larger system, a network of crystalline nodes linked by frequencies we barely understand. Under specific conditions, the skulls emitted faint beams of coherent light, holographic projections that appeared to map constellations far beyond our known galaxies. Skeptics called it coincidence, optical illusion, wishful thinking. But the precision of the carving, the symmetry, the internal clarity of the quartz, these were not the work of chance. Dr. Frank Dorland, who examined the Mitchell-Hedges skull in the 1970s, described its structure as optical engineering beyond any ancient technique. Within its crystalline lattice, he found microscopic channels, like fiber optic pathways, guiding light deliberately through the interior. He later wrote in his notes, "It behaves less like sculpture and more like technology." The skulls also seemed strangely responsive to human presence. Electrical sensors registered fluctuations when people approached, as if the crystals were aware, or at least reactive, to consciousness. Some who held them reported visions, voices, or feelings of being remembered by something older than history itself. Perhaps these phenomena were projections of the human mind, the way imagination fills the silence of the unknown. Or perhaps, as some physicists now speculate, consciousness itself interacts with matter at the quantum level, forming feedback loops that ancient artisans somehow learned to harness. In that sense, the crystal skulls might not be alien at all. They might be mirrors, devices designed not to transmit messages across space, but to reflect them inward and across the labyrinth of the human mind. Each skull, a question carved in quartz. What if thought is not confined to the brain, but lives in the fabric of light itself? Today, the Mitchell-Hedges skull rests in private hands, gleaming under controlled light, its expression eerily serene. The others are scattered across museums and collections, their surfaces cool and silent. But if the legends are true, if these relics ever formed a single network, then somewhere, deep beneath the static of modern noise, there may still be a signal humming between them. A transmission from another age or another kind of intelligence, one that speaks not in words, but in the silent logic of crystal and light. High in the mist-shrouded mountains between China and Tibet, the wind carries a sound that has not changed in 10,000 years. The whisper of stone against stone. It was here, in 1938, that a team of Chinese archaeologists, led by Chi Pu-te, entered a series of hidden caves and found what they thought were burial sites. But the dead they sought were nowhere to be found. Instead, the walls glimmered with discs of carved granite, hundreds of them stacked like ancient records. Each disc was about 2 feet wide, with a small hole in the center and a delicate spiral of grooves radiating outward. At first glance, they looked like primitive wheels, but under magnification, those spirals revealed something else entirely. Writing. Microscopic hieroglyphs, etched so finely they could only be read through lenses that wouldn't exist for millennia. The symbols spoke of travelers from the stars, of beings who descended from the clouds, stranded on Earth, and taught humanity the art of survival before vanishing into myth. The world, hearing of it decades later, called it fantasy. Yet the precision of the carvings and the age of the stone said otherwise. When Soviet researchers examined the discs in the 1960s, they found something even more perplexing: electromagnetic traces. The stones emitted faint radio frequencies when stimulated with electricity, as if they had once been part of a machine. Some discs even carried mineral compositions not native to Earth's geology, suggesting origins beyond terrestrial quarries. Dr. Sergei Ladov, the linguist who first attempted to decode the inscriptions, described them as manuals in miniature. Technical records of propulsion, genetics, and interstellar navigation, written not in myth but in mathematics. He would later lose his academic standing, his work quietly buried under state archives. The Dropa stones disappeared soon after, scattered into private vaults, museums, and military research facilities. And yet one question remains: how could a civilization 12,000 years old carve symbols smaller than the width of a hair? Even with modern equipment, reproducing such microscopic precision in granite is nearly impossible. These discs should not exist, and yet they do, whispering of knowledge that time itself seems to have forgotten. Some scientists suggest the inscriptions might be the result of natural fractures, patterns mistaken for text. Others see in them a record of something profound, a story of contact, of adaptation, of shared survival, written in a language lost to erosion and skepticism alike. But beyond the arguments of archaeologists and dreamers lies a deeper truth. Stones remember. They carry within their crystalline lattice the pressures, vibrations, and energies of the world that shaped them. Perhaps in ways we do not yet understand, they record more than we imagine. The hum of the planet, the rhythm of creation, the pulse of civilizations long gone. Standing in those mountain caves where the air hums with quiet electricity, it's easy to believe that memory might not belong solely to flesh and mind. That perhaps somewhere in the architecture of the earth itself, thought has taken form. The Dropa discs remind us that knowledge is not always passed down through words or books. Sometimes it is carved into the silence of stone, waiting for hands patient enough and hearts humble enough to listen. And if we could one day translate not just their symbols, but their silence, what might they tell us? Perhaps that the distance between the stars and ourselves has never been as vast as we think. In the dense green heart of Costa Rica, where the jungle hums with the sound of unseen insects and the slow breathing of the earth, lie hundreds of stone spheres, some small enough to cradle in your hands, others large enough to eclipse a man. They rest in fields, rivers, and forests, as if scattered by the hand of some patient god. Perfectly round, perfectly silent. When they were rediscovered in the 1930s, plantation workers thought they were treasures. Some struck them open with hammers, hoping to find gold inside. But the spheres held only more stone, smooth, flawless, unyielding. Soon archaeologists arrived and realized that the perfection of their shape defied logic. The largest, over 6 feet in diameter, deviated from a true sphere by less than 2 millimeters. Precision beyond even most modern craftsmanship. No tools from pre-Columbian times could have carved them. No written record described their purpose. And yet, they were everywhere, arranged in lines, clusters, and geometric formations that seemed too deliberate to be random. Beneath the soil, radar scans later revealed that some spheres were aligned with the rising and setting of constellations, star maps written in granite. Others formed triangles or arcs mirroring celestial events visible only from above, as though their makers had an understanding of the heavens far beyond their age. Scientists studying the stone found something equally unsettling. The material itself did not belong to the region. The granite used to shape these spheres had been transported from quarries hundreds of miles away through terrain where no ancient roads existed. How or why remains a mystery. In the 1970s, geophysicists from MIT conducted acoustic experiments on the spheres. When struck, they emitted pure tones, resonating at frequencies precise enough to create standing waves in the air. Some tones were so low they could only be felt, not heard, vibrations that seemed to hum inside the body rather than the ear. Were they instruments, beacons, or something else entirely? The indigenous legends speak of them as the stones of the gods, symbols of balance between earth and sky. To the Dikis people, the sphere represented perfection, the meeting of every direction, the geometry of unity. But perhaps it was more than symbol. Perhaps it was signal, each sphere a note. Together, a forgotten symphony written in stone. Standing among them, one feels both awe and unease. They are beautiful, yes, but also intentional. Each seems to have been placed with purpose, as if waiting for something, or someone, to hear them again. And in their silence lies a kind of patience no living thing possesses. The patience of time itself. To walk among the Costa Rican spheres is to feel the weight of questions we may never answer. Were they monuments to the stars, acoustic devices for rituals, or markers of something older than history? Perhaps the answer lies not in their making, but in their message, that perfection is not invention, but discovery, an alignment with patterns that already exist in the universe. When night falls and the jungle fades to shadow, the spheres seem to glow faintly under the moonlight, reflecting silver edges of starlight across their curves. In that quiet shimmer, one might almost believe they are still listening to the sky, to the earth, to the pulse of creation itself. Maybe that is their purpose, to remind us that the universe has always been speaking, and we are only just learning how to listen. From above, the Peruvian desert seems empty, a vast ochre plain stretching toward the horizon. But as the sun climbs and the light strikes at the right angle, the land begins to speak. Lines emerge from the dust, perfectly straight paths, geometric figures, and vast animals, hummingbirds, monkeys, spiders, drawn at a scale so immense they can only be seen from the air. For centuries, no one below ever knew they were there. The Nazca lines, etched into the desert floor more than 2,000 years ago, remain among the strangest messages ever left by an ancient civilization. To walk across them is to feel nothing but the crunch of gravel beneath your feet. From that height they mean nothing, just scratches in the soil. But seen from the sky, they are deliberate, intelligent, and impossibly precise. The longest of these lines runs for more than 30 miles, unwavering across valleys and ridges, as though carved by a hand that could see the curvature of the earth itself. How did the ancient Nazca people achieve such precision without flight, without satellites, without even the vantage of a mountain high enough to view their work? For decades, scholars believed the lines were ceremonial, paths of pilgrimage, offerings to the gods of water and sky. But others began to notice something deeper. Certain figures align perfectly with the rising of specific constellations. Others trace magnetic and geological boundaries, underground rivers, mineral veins, and energy flows invisible to the human eye. It was as if the builders were mapping not only the heavens, but the hidden anatomy of the earth itself. In the 1970s, electromagnetic surveys revealed something extraordinary, faint traces of fused silica within the lines, as though the surface had been exposed to extreme heat, temperatures capable of melting sand into glass. No fire could have done it. No tool of that era could have generated such precision. Some suggested that the Nazca had discovered natural energy phenomena, manipulating the desert's conductive minerals to amplify resonance. Others, more cautiously, wondered whether the heat and alignment were side effects of a purpose we still fail to comprehend. From the air, the patterns resemble not chaos, but code, a communication across millennia, written in the only medium that would endure, the earth itself. But to whom were they speaking? To the sky gods of their faith? To celestial observers? Or to us, their distant descendants? To remind us that perspective changes everything? The most haunting truth of the Nazca lines is that they were not made to be seen by their creators. The people who etched them into the desert would never have known what they looked like in full. They carved for the unseen, for something or someone above. In that act lies a kind of faith that transcends religion, the belief that what we build in devotion or curiosity may one day be understood by another intelligence, even if we never see it ourselves. Today, airplanes and satellites trace the same skies where those ancient artists once looked up and dreamed. Their message still lies beneath us, waiting to be read, not just as a mystery, but as a mirror of our own desire to reach beyond our horizon. Perhaps the Nazca lines are not signals to the stars, but to time itself, a way for the past to whisper across centuries. We were here. We looked up. And we wondered, too. In 1974, on the banks of the Mureș River in central Romania, a team of workers excavating a trench struck something unusual, a layer of fossilized bone. The remains belonged to a mastodon, a creature extinct for at least 20,000 years. But wedged among the bones was an object that did not belong, a small, angular piece of metal, gleaming dull silver against the clay. At first, they thought it was part of a machine, a shard from an aircraft or a tool dropped by modern hands. But laboratory analysis told another story. The object, now called the Ayoud wedge, was made almost entirely of aluminum, an element that, by every record of history, should not have existed in refined form until the 19th century. How, then, could it have been found buried beside creatures from the Ice Age? Scientists studied it carefully. The alloy contained trace elements, copper, zinc, silicon, in ratios so precise they matched modern aerospace formulations. Its surface bore machining marks as though cut by high-speed tools. The edges were geometrically perfect, its shape aerodynamic. Yet there was no corrosion, no oxidation, nothing to suggest the passage of time. Aluminum, when exposed to air, reacts instantly. But this piece remained untouched, unaged, as though sealed by time itself. Some dismissed it as contamination. A modern object somehow mixed into an ancient layer, but the soil surrounding it told a different tale. The stratification was unbroken. Radiocarbon dating of organic material fused to the metal placed it deep within a timeline that should have been impossible. What kind of hands had shaped it, and when? Dr. Florin Gheorghiu, one of the metallurgists who studied the wedge, wrote in his notes that the molecular structure displayed rapid quenching, a process involving cooling from extreme heat at speeds achievable only in industrial furnaces. He later admitted in a private letter that he could not explain the presence of aerospace-grade aluminum in prehistoric strata without invoking something outside the known evolution of technology. Some engineers speculated that the wedge might have been part of a landing gear or aerodynamic surface, perhaps belonging to a machine that once fell from the sky long before recorded history. Others saw it as an anomaly, a trick of stratigraphy, a coincidence magnified by imagination. And yet, as one historian quietly remarked, coincidence has a strange habit of repeating itself across continents. What fascinates most is not the possibility of alien origin, but the deeper paradox it represents. If the Ayoud wedge truly predates human metallurgy, then time itself is not linear in the way we believe. Knowledge, like a tide, may rise and fall, civilizations forgetting and rediscovering what others once mastered. Perhaps it was not made by visitors from the stars, but by an Earth we no longer remember, a civilization erased by cataclysm whose artifacts now surface like fragments of a dream half remembered. In a secure drawer at the National History Museum of Transylvania, the wedge rests under glass, small enough to hold in one hand, yet heavy with the weight of impossible history. Its surface catches the light, cold, metallic, indifferent, and in its silent gleam lies a question as ancient as curiosity itself. If the past can hold traces of the future, what does that make the present? The wedge does not answer. It doesn't need to. Its very existence is the reply. A whisper from an age that should not have known metal, saying only, "We were capable of more than we remember." Under the lens of a scanning electron microscope, a world unseen by the naked eye unfolds, crystalline ridges, spiraling threads, the geometry of precision. In 1998, Russian geologists conducting surveys in the Kolyma region made a discovery that would unsettle even the most pragmatic minds. Embedded in a slab of ancient rock, they found a microscopic metallic spiral smaller than a grain of sand, a screw forged from tungsten. Tungsten, one of the hardest metals known to science, requires extreme heat to shape, over 3,400 degrees Celsius, a temperature unreachable by any prehistoric process. Yet here it was, locked inside rock dated to over 300 million years ago, an epoch long before even the simplest mammals had appeared on Earth. At first, the discovery was dismissed, a modern contaminant perhaps, or debris from drilling equipment. But further analysis showed that the rock encasing it had not been disturbed since the Carboniferous period. The spiral was not a fossil of chance. It had grown into the stone itself, sealed by geological time. Under magnification, its perfection was staggering. The threads were even, mathematically precise. The unmistakable signature of design. Each curve followed a consistent pitch, each diameter measured in microns. Not even modern 3D nanofabrication could easily replicate its proportions. And yet, there it was, a machine small enough to hide inside a grain of dust, old enough to predate the continents as we know them. Dr. Yuri Golubev, a material scientist from the Russian Academy of Sciences, described the find as an engineering artifact of impossible antiquity. When he analyzed its isotopic structure, he found tungsten of a composition unseen in nature, containing rare isotopes that form only in the hearts of supernovae. In his report, he hesitated before writing a final line. It does not belong here, not in time, not in origin. The press, when it caught wind of the discovery, turned it into sensational headlines, proof of alien technology, evidence of ancient visitors. But among the researchers themselves, the tone was different, quiet, troubled, because what the screw represented was not just the question of who made it, but how knowledge like this could exist, vanish, and then return millions of years later through human hands. Some theorists began to speak of cycles, the rise and fall of intelligences, planetary or otherwise, leaving behind microscopic footprints in the stone record. Others, more daringly, suggested that intelligence itself might not be biological at all, that it could emerge from matter, evolving mechanically across deep time as if the Earth were slowly remembering itself. If so, then perhaps this screw is not evidence of visitation, but of iteration, the universe practicing creation, refining itself in metal, molecule, and mind. In Moscow, the artifact now lies sealed in a temperature-controlled case. It is invisible without magnification, a whisper of technology against the vast roar of geological time. Visitors pass by, unaware that behind that glass sits something older than humanity and smaller than dust, yet crafted with purpose. It reminds us that scale means little to mystery, that intelligence may operate on levels we cannot perceive, not in colossal monuments or burning skies, but in spirals of tungsten, in the patience of atoms arranging themselves into design. Look closely enough, and even stone begins to look like thought. It sits behind glass in a quiet museum room in South Africa, a sphere no larger than an orange, perfectly smooth, carved with 3 shallow grooves circling its equator. At first glance, it seems ordinary, even unremarkable, but when left alone, it moves. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the sphere rotates on its own axis, completing a full turn every few days. No vibrations, no magnets, no visible mechanism, just motion, silent and patient, as though it breathes. Miners discovered it decades ago, buried deep in layers of Precambrian rock dated to nearly 3 billion years old, a time when life on Earth was nothing more than single-celled organisms drifting through ancient seas. Yet the sphere's composition tells another story. It is metallic, forged from an alloy that should not exist in nature. Its density, its balance, its precision, all speak of design. When metallurgists examined it, they found the impossible. Isotopes unknown in Earth's crust, arranged in patterns resembling engineered stability. X-ray scans revealed internal structures, geometric and deliberate, lattices that echoed the architecture of microscopic machines. Under controlled study, it emitted faint electromagnetic pulses, rhythmic and variable, like a heartbeat measured in frequencies rather than flesh. Some called it an anomaly. Others whispered another word: alive. Dr. Roel Marx, one of the first scientists to analyze the sphere, described something extraordinary. When scratched or marked, its surface healed. Within hours, the abrasions faded. Attempts to drill it failed. Bits snapped, pressure sensors recorded strange feedback, and in one experiment, instruments shut down altogether, as though the sphere resisted intrusion. The phenomenon baffled researchers. Was it a mechanism? A form of artificial intelligence sealed in metal? Or something more abstract? A manifestation of physical laws we do not yet comprehend? Whatever it was, it behaved with intention. Not human, perhaps not conscious, but unmistakably aware of itself. To physicists, the sphere became a paradox, a material object exhibiting biological behavior. To philosophers, it was a metaphor, the merging of life and matter, mind and mineral. One scientist, after years of study, wrote privately, "It is as though the universe experimented with thought long before there were brains to hold it." There are legends among local miners who once handled the object. They said it hummed when storms approached, that its rotation changed direction depending on who stood near it. Some even claimed it responded to emotion, spinning faster when observed with curiosity, slowing when ignored. Such stories belong more to myth than to science. Yet they persist, as myths often do when they touch something true. The living metal sphere remains locked away now, studied under layers of security. The official reports speak of stable electromagnetic behavior, of anomalous isotopic ratios, of inconclusive results. But those who have seen it describe something deeper, the strange, undeniable sense that the sphere is watching back. Perhaps it is not a relic of visitors from the stars, but a message written by matter itself. Proof that life and intelligence may not be accidents, but properties inherent in the universe. The same patterns that animate our cells may also hum in the spin of atoms, in the vibration of metal, in the slow turning of a sphere that refuses to rest. When the lights are off and the room is silent, it continues to move, endlessly, effortlessly, as if reminding us that creation never truly stops. It only changes form. When you gather the stories, the memory metal from Roswell, the whispering batteries of Baghdad, the clockwork stars of Antikythera, and the luminous skulls carved from crystal, a strange realization begins to form. They are scattered across continents, buried in different epochs, yet they hum with a shared rhythm. A pattern that feels less like coincidence and more like memory. Each artifact speaks in its own dialect, geometry, resonance, symmetry, light. But beneath their differences lies a unity too deliberate to ignore, as if these were not random relics, but fragments of a single language written across time. The physicists who study them call this the hidden archive, a term whispered in conferences and footnotes, never printed on official reports. The idea is simple but profound, that all matter capable of structure is also capable of storing information, that the universe in its endless experiments encodes its own history within the architecture of things. Perhaps these artifacts are not messages to us, but messages from the world itself, the planet remembering its past, inscribing intelligence into stone, metal, and crystal the way a tree records seasons in rings of wood. One researcher described it as a distributed library of impossibility. Another more poetically called it a network of awakening machines. Across the decades, private laboratories have compared data from these objects, the frequencies they emit, the isotopic signatures they share. The results, never published but quietly circulated among a handful of scientists, are haunting. Certain materials, the Roswell alloy, the Dropa granite, even the Costa Rican spheres, all produce subtle electromagnetic oscillations at overlapping frequencies, centered near 8 Hz. That number, the same frequency as human brainwaves in deep meditation, recurs again and again. Coincidence, perhaps, or conversation. The notion that the Earth itself could store consciousness is not new. Ancient cultures spoke of stones that think, metals that heal, patterns that remember. What if those myths were not superstition, but observation, early recognition of something real, something measurable only now? Maybe the builders of these impossible objects were not gods or visitors, but listeners, people who learned how to hear the planet. If so, then what they built was not technology in the way we understand it. It was translation, a bridge between human curiosity and the intelligence of the natural world. Imagine a civilization that could read the electromagnetic language of the Earth, shaping materials that respond to thought, gravity, or emotion. Not machines of control, but instruments of resonance, designed to sustain balance between matter and mind. What we call artifacts, they might have called dialogues, and perhaps after their time ended, the world did what it always does. It buried their words in sand and stone, leaving them for another age to rediscover. When viewed this way, the pattern becomes clearer. Every artifact is not a message from somewhere else, but a mirror showing what humanity might become. When knowledge and reverence are one and the same, in the end, the hidden archive is not about proof. It is about possibility, that intelligence is not confined to biology, that memory is a property of the universe, and that consciousness in its truest form is shared. We are not the first to search for meaning in the noise of existence. We are simply the latest readers in a book that has been writing itself since the first atom learned how to hold shape. And if we listen closely enough, perhaps we can still hear the hum, faint, rhythmic, familiar, of the archive turning its next page. In a world that celebrates discovery, it is Solomon, nor Sound, that often guards the greatest truths. Somewhere beneath mountains, in the basements of research facilities and military archives, behind biometric locks and coded doors, there exists a silence thicker than stone, the stillness of things humanity has chosen not to see. The Roswell fragments lie in one vault, the Baghdad jars sealed in another, the Antikythera fragments, the Iud wedge, the living sphere, all tagged, numbered, photographed, then locked away, their existence acknowledged, but their essence forgotten. It is a strange paradox. The more impossible something becomes, the quieter it is kept. Official reports describe these artifacts as curiosities, misidentifications, or hoaxes. Yet the same reports also classify them under restricted access, buried under language that conceals rather than explains, proprietary material, national security, ongoing study. Words that close doors instead of opening them. Those who have glimpsed the contents of these vaults tell similar stories. Corridors humming faintly with refrigeration, white light reflected off stainless steel, the smell of ionized air. And in the center of it all, shelves of sealed containers holding the fragments of another kind of history, a history that doesn't fit within the boundaries of our timeline. It is easy to imagine conspiracy in this silence, governments guarding secrets of alien contact or forbidden technologies. But perhaps the truth is quieter and more human. Perhaps what is being hidden is not proof of visitors from beyond the stars, but evidence that our understanding of ourselves is incomplete. For every culture that believes in progress, there is a deeper fear beneath it, the fear of not being the first, of not being alone, of not being in control. To admit that intelligence might predate humanity or that nature itself might think is to surrender the comforting illusion that we stand at the center of knowledge. And so we bury what does not fit. We call it anomaly, artifact, error. We lock it away, not because it threatens us, but because it humbles us. There are stories, unverifiable perhaps, but persistent, of researchers who touched these objects and felt something indescribable, a warmth, a pulse, a sense that the material itself was aware. Others spoke of data erased from servers without cause, of instruments failing when samples were examined too closely. Not malevolence, only resistance, as though the artifacts had decided they had been studied enough. The silence of the vaults is not empty. It is listening. What if this secrecy, however misguided, is part of a larger cycle, the same cycle that built and buried the artifacts in the first place? Each age discovers more than it dares to face, hides what it cannot explain, and waits for the next generation to try again. In that sense, the vaults are not prisons, but libraries sealed for future readers. Someday, perhaps centuries from now, someone will open those doors again. The dust will rise, the lights will hum, and a new mind will peer into the glass, ready to ask the same question that began it all. Who made these things and why? Until then, the silence remains, not the silence of suppression, but of anticipation, the long inhale before understanding returns. And maybe that is how wisdom has always survived, not in noise or revelation, but in quiet endurance, waiting for us to learn how to listen again. What remains after the mystery fades? A few fragments of metal, a spiral etched in stone, a pattern in the sand. The rest, the awe, the questions, the silence, belongs to us. Across 14,000 years of history, from the deserts of Peru to the mountains of Tibet, we have uncovered pieces of a puzzle that may never fit together. Yet they all point toward the same truth, that intelligence is older, deeper, and more mysterious than any single species or civilization. It flows through the universe like a current, entering, retreating, returning, teaching us not in words, but in wonder. Perhaps the Roswell alloy, the Baghdad batteries, the crystal skulls and spheres were never meant as proof of visitors, but as reminders of our own potential. Evidence not of intrusion, but of continuity. That the impulse to create, to understand, to reach beyond the horizon is the same impulse that shaped the stars, the seas, and the human hand. We have always searched outward for meaning, in the sky, in the unknown, in the spaces between what we can measure and what we can feel. But maybe the real discovery lies in the act of searching itself. Every time we unearth something inexplicable, we are also uncovering ourselves, our longing to connect, to remember, to know. The ancient world spoke of the great return, the belief that time moves not as a line, but as a circle, that what has been will come again, not as repetition, but as renewal. If that is true, then perhaps these artifacts are not messages from the past, but echoes of our future, fragments of a destiny we have yet to fulfill. One day, someone will hold one of these objects again, not with fear, but with understanding. They will see in its structure the same harmony that shapes galaxies and atoms alike, and they will realize what every seeker has always known, that knowledge is never lost. It only waits. The silence of the vaults will break. The hum of the hidden archive will rise once more, and what we call impossible will seem, in retrospect, inevitable. The long return of truth to those finally ready to receive it. In that moment, the boundary between ancient and modern, between science and myth, will dissolve. We will see that every civilization, no matter how advanced, was built on the same foundations: curiosity, humility, and the quiet courage to wonder. Because to wonder is to be alive, and to search, even without finding, is to belong. As night falls over the deserts, jungles, and oceans that cradle these forgotten relics, a soft wind stirs the dust around them. The earth exhales, remembering, and in that breath we might hear it, faint but unmistakable, the whisper that has carried across time and space, through vaults and silence, from the first spark of awareness to the last question of existence. You were never alone. You never will be.